sons of Korah, which are servants in the temple that were, I guess you would say, established, organized by David. And that's written or recorded for us in the latter part of the book of 1 Chronicles. And so we're reading songs that people would sing. And this particular psalm, Psalm 87, is rather short, it's only 7 verses, but there's some, I think, some good principles for us to apply, which is, since the law of Moses is not our law, we need to be able to take principles from it. So, his foundation is in the holy mountains. The Lord loveth the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. We've talked about this to some extent. What is Zion? Just another name for Jerusalem. It's kind of the high point of the city. Sometimes it's referred to as the city of David. And that statement there in verse 2, the Lord loveth the gates of Zion. Somebody turn over to 1 Kings 11. 1 Kings 11, and read for us, please, verse 36. 1 Kings 11:36. Okay, this is basically as Israel is splitting into northern Israel or Samaria and southern Israel or Judah. And this prophecy is given to Jeroboam, who was a servant of Solomon, but who was prophesied to by Abijah that he would become the king of northern Israel and he would receive 10 tribes. And so 1 Kings 11:36 there, telling us, my servant David, he will always have a light before me in Jerusalem. That's the city that God chose. And there are several references in the book of Deuteronomy as they're getting ready to cross into the promised land that God had a place that He chose where He would put His name. Well, the Lord loveth the gates of Zion. And it's not that He loves that one region of Palestine. It's the significance of the throne. It's the significance of the promise of David. Not necessarily a geographic, He loves that region of the country. It's all the promises that are tied into the promises given to David. And of course that, going back to the days of Samuel, Nathan the prophet, 2 Samuel chapter 7, where those promises were made to David about his throne and all of that. But anyway, I think, like principles, how would you apply that to the church? Well, God loves His city, the place where His name is glorified. And I think of passages like Ephesians 3, verses 20 and 21, that Christ is glorified in the church. 1 Timothy 3:15 talks to us about the church as the household of God. It's the pillar and ground of the truth. We have all of these passages that talk about the church and members of the church. 2 Timothy 2 and verse 19. The Lord knows those who are His. And so God has, from the beginning, God has always had His people. And of course, we're back here in the monarchy, in the reign of different kings. But anyway, that promise, or those promises, have been fulfilled by God, and His purpose is going to be accomplished through them, of course, ultimately to bring about the Christ. Glorious things are spoken of thee, O city of God. Well, parallels about the church, okay? How we speak of the church, how we treat the church, is how we treat Christ. You've heard me talk about that before with Saul of Tarsus. He's persecuting the church, Acts 8:4, but what did Jesus say in Acts chapter 9? Saul, Saul, what? Why are you persecuting me? So that's kind of the same principle that we have here in Psalm 87. These are God's people. Again, it's not just a physical location that we're dealing with here. Glorious things are spoken of thee, O city of God. I was doing my typical study today, and I was listening to a podcast as I was making some other putting some other material together. And this individual was talking about the church and the Christ and how those two things are inseparable. And he brought up the fact that we can, and this is something that we need to be careful about, we can separate the two. You know, if all we think about is just the church, and what I mean by that is, if we think that, and you've heard me say this before, but you know, what we do inside these four walls is all that Christianity is about, well, that's not true. Well, what we're doing, though, when we do have that mentality, when a person or a congregation maybe has that mentality, is they're really separating Christ from the church. What are we as Christians doing? I mean, what is our ultimate goal in this life? I'm not talking about heaven. But as Christians, what is my individual goal? What is your individual pursuit? Let me use that word. As a Christian. Okay, that's one of them. But I mean big picture. Go to heaven. Praise God. These are all good answers. Good example. I heard two at once. What? That's the one I was looking for. Everything you guys said was right. But, you know, one passage I think of is like 1 Peter 2:21. He left us an example that we should follow in his steps. C.S. Lewis, and I forget what he wrote it in. It was referenced in another book that I read recently. Talks about the Christian's goal should be to be a little Christ, an imitator of Christ. That is, and so if we, okay, so here's another question. What is one common charge that people will use against the church to justify their not coming to church? Okay, all right. Two of you said it. That's exactly it. Too many hypocrites down there. There may be. That may be true sometimes. But if our only focus is, like I said, what we do in this building, and we fail to imitate the Christ, if we fail to walk in His steps, then just stay home on Sunday. Right? You're not doing any good in here. Very true. Very true. Well, and, you know, you're not going to be judged, Jeff, by what somebody else does anyway. But that's an easy out a lot of times. Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite books, and the more and more I read it, it becomes this way, is Ezekiel. Because Ezekiel is, his message, well, he's in Babylonian captivity with Israel, with Judah. But one message from beginning to end is the soul who sins shall die. Personal responsibility. And we live in an age where personal responsibility is not, that's not high on a lot of people's priority list. It's a lot easier to blame my failures on somebody else. Well, I would have done this if, and then you fill in the blank. I wouldn't have acted this way if so-and-so would have done this. Yeah, good luck trying that with God. When you get to judgment, like Timber was saying, hand over that excuse and see what happens. It's not going to work. But anyway, Psalm 87:3, glorious things are spoken of thee, O city of God. Kind of, not really got off course, but a little bit. But how do we speak about the church? How do we speak about our fellow members of the church? Something to think about. I'll make mention of Rahab and Babylon. Rahab is another word. This is used a few times in the Old Testament. It's another word for Egypt. So you might make a note of that if you make notes in your Bible. Egypt, Babylon, Philistia, Tyre, Ethiopia, these different regions. This man was born there. And some believe that verses 4 and 5, the rest of this psalm, are kind of messianic, talking about people from all over making up the city of God. Well, of course, Old Testament dispensation, the Jews made up the people of God. They're His chosen nation. Whereas in the spiritual city of God, in fact, Hebrews 12 calls it the New Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem. It doesn't matter where you're from. It's like Peter told Cornelius in Acts 10, whoever fears God and works righteousness is accepted with Him. So some people look at this particular psalm in regard to the city of God as forward-looking to the church. And all of these people from different locations, well, they were born there. Well, to become a member of the church, you have to be born into it, don't you? Born again, I mean. You know, as a part of the Mosaic law was you're born. What happens on day 8 for the males? They're circumcised. That's a sign of the covenant. You're literally physically born into a covenant with God under the Mosaic law. Not so in Christianity. You have to be taught and then born again, the new birth. So I guess that's a possible understanding here when these other nations are mentioned. And of Zion it shall be said, this and that man was born in her, and the highest Himself shall establish her. So anyway, what we're talking about there perhaps. The Lord shall count when He writeth up the people, that this man was born there. Well, does the Bible talk about God having a book? Or a roll, maybe? Roll call? He has a book of life, doesn't He? And this goes all the way back to Exodus 32. The first time we read about it in Scripture is when Moses is interceding for the Israelites, when they made that golden calf, and God's ready to destroy them. He said, listen, I pray thee blot my name out of the book of life. And of course, God's response is, I can't do that. God knows those who are His. As well the singers as the players on instruments shall be there. All my springs are in thee. So, again, understanding the historical context, you have a nation that's governed by God, by the laws of God. And so this, in a sense, is a political psalm praising God's actions on behalf of and praising the city of God, praising His people in general. But I think there are principles to be applied there for the church today, too. Any questions on Psalm 87? What Jeff said. Somebody watching the live stream talking about hypocrites, they said, well, people who say that don't have a problem going to work with them. That's a fair point. You get a paycheck at the end of the week there, don't you? And I think sometimes we are so short-sighted that we fail to see that principle spiritually. And by we, I mean people in general, that so many people are just locked in the here and now. All right.
There's also an element of what we talked about this before, that the world seems to have this idea that Christians should just be perfect.
Yeah.
And if you're not, we're a hypocrite.
Right. Yeah, that as far as that's concerned, if that were the case, then there's no hope for anybody ever if you have to be perfect. But you're right, that's a misconception that folks have. Only God can judge me. That's a very common refrain, isn't it, that people have. And that, so what's the answer to that? What's the answer to somebody that tells you that? You can't judge me. Yeah. Well, I mean, saying what God says doesn't make me the judge. Garrett and I, we have a podcast that we listen to together each night. And the one we listened to last night was called, no, not last night, Monday night, was called Say the Hard Things. There are some hard things to be said. Sometimes we need to say hard things to each other. Sometimes we need to have hard things said to us. But, if we're just always nice and try to do everything at all times to not have any confrontation or not ever hurt anybody's feelings, which that's not ever our intent anyway. But sometimes the truth hurts. If your goal is to never offend and never hurt anybody, then just keep your mouth shut. Because, so let's say on an average Sunday we have 130, let's just say, 130 to 140 in here. I know that I've said things that have offended people. Not intentionally. My goal is not to, as a preacher, get up there and look at a specific person and preach to them to the exclusion of everybody else. But if the shoe fits, what are you going to kill the messenger? And is that going to change the truth? So the idea of you can't judge me, only God can judge me. Well, that's true in one sense. God's the only judge. But the Christian knows what the judge has said. Yes.
If what they read is against their own ideology.
Yes.
Like they're going to say, well, you're just judging me. I'm like, well, I didn't write it. I'm just reading it, trying to follow it. That's what it says.
Yeah.
But that's how, it's very hard to have, if someone is that way, you cannot have a good, open conversation.
Yeah, it's hard to talk to that. Yeah. Well, you're... Yes. That's exactly right. And that may be a good approach. Listen, this is the standard. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're Christian or non-Christian. God's law applies to you, period. It's the same. You want to say something? Yeah.
They come in and they see people that they may know from the community who come here every time the doors are open. They're accepted in the congregation, but yet they know that so-and-so did this, and boy, their kid, they go out Saturday night and do things they should, or whatever the case may be. That hurts the church. So
Sure.
So we can look at it from that perspective, but we also need to keep in mind that we as Christians are the examples, and people do look at us, and it is human nature for people to, people don't like to be told something by someone who does the same stuff, or who may hold their family at a different standard than everybody else's family.
Yeah.
Because some people are people might consider judgmental, but then when somebody in their family happens to, then it's different,
Yeah,
And that hurts the church.
absolutely. Everybody's accountable to the same standard. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter. God has one standard for all people for all time.
I keep getting letters, somebody on Road 142, anyway, they're evidently Jehovah's Witness, but it's a whole page of handwritten, and I've gotten 2 or 3 letters, and I just told her that somebody was misguiding her.
Yeah. Well, there is such thing as truth and there is such thing as error. So,
I think Regina's hitting them also.
yeah.
If you send them back the Fulton County Gospel News, you won't get any more.
What'd you say now?
If you send them back the Fulton County Gospel News, you won't get any more.
Is that how it works, Timber?
That's how it works for me.
That was Timber said that.
They put their original address on the envelope, so I just sent them back the Fulton County
Yeah.
Gospel News.
Yeah. Well, sadly, that's true. And Okay, so think about that tactic for just a minute, because I've done the same thing when they come to my door. Hey, let's come in and talk. Let's study the Bible. They don't really want you to say much. And when there's any confrontation, you're the bad guy for confronting it. Well, that's exactly what our culture is doing right now with, I guess you would frame it as, I would frame it as conservatives versus not liberals, but progressives. The progressives' goal is not dialogue. It's, you either agree with me or you're evil. There's no middle ground and there's no discussion. So you'll see these conservatives go to campuses all over the country, and they'll literally be shouted down. And people will just stand there in the crowd, and they won't say anything. They'll just scream at the top of their lungs. That's what they do. And well, there's no way to have a dialogue there. And some people, and it's like Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 2, some people have not received the love of the truth, and so they'll believe a delusion. You can't do a whole lot with that. No, it doesn't do any good. But whatever the case may be, everything we've said, here's the conclusion we need to come to. With what Tammy was saying, we need to live consistent lives. That doesn't mean perfect. We get that, but we need to be consistent and faithful. And we need to be willing to engage people. And, okay, so it was brought up, folks who may, these institutions that take surveys, they refer to people who are not churchgoers as unchurched. So I'll just borrow that language. Folks who are unchurched may be uncomfortable coming into a building maybe they've been to for a funeral, or maybe they've never been into at all. What do we do to welcome them? Because, let me ask you this. Is anybody welcome to walk in here on a Sunday and worship? Yeah? Absolutely. And so how do we, if they don't look like us, they sit near where we normally sit, do we move somewhere else so we don't get mixed up with that crowd? We should be kind and respectful and encouraging and speak to them. Be the first one that's there to talk to them. If we all did that, well, that'd get pretty busy back there in the foyer, wouldn't it? Treat people like you want to be treated. I think somebody said that sometime, didn't they? Yeah. Yeah. Sharon, we're going to have to make some kind of secondary QR code for Sharon. I don't know. Well, maybe you opened the door. You never know. Yeah. It says it right on the card. Scan me. That's all right. Let's go to Psalm 88 here. I didn't think we'd spend that much time in Psalm 87. We really didn't. But let's go to Psalm 88. This psalm, the first 9 verses are about suffering, so we won't spend a lot of time because we've talked so much about that throughout this particular study. But look at Psalm 88 in verse 3. He says, "My soul is full of troubles, and my life draweth nigh unto the grave." I feel like I'm going to die. Again, we've talked about that a lot. If you make notes in your Bible, maybe out to the side of verse 3, write 2 Corinthians 4, where Paul talks about he was hard-pressed, perplexed, crushed, but he was not forsaken. And anyway, that's a good text to put side by side with that. Well, so then verses 10 through 12, okay, if God, if you're going to let this go on, completely deserted, completely alone, well, I'm just going to die, and I can't do anything for you when I'm dead. That's how low whoever wrote this psalm was feeling. Verse 10, wilt thou show wonders to the dead? Shall the dead arise and praise thee? You need to do something now, so I can do something in a sense. Shall thy loving kindness be declared in the grave, or thy faithfulness in destruction? So there's kind of two sides to that. The way I see it is, well, God, I wish you'd do something now so I would feel better. But also, once you're dead, you can't talk about the love of God to anybody. You can't talk about His grace and mercy. You're done. Your chance is over, isn't it? I always think of Lazarus in Luke. Is that right? The rich man. The rich man in Luke 16. I've got 5 brothers. If one would go back from the dead, but they might listen to him. He said, no, they've got Moses and the prophets. So, kind of verses 10 through 12. I can't do anything when I'm dead. Please act now. Well, then you get down beginning in verse 13. Look at verse 13. But unto thee have I cried, O Lord, and in the morning shall my prayer prevent thee. This is one of those issues with the King James. What does the New King James say? Come before. This word meant something different than it means now. My prayer will come before thee. I'm going to send it up in the morning. Lord, why castest thou off my soul? Why hidest thou thy face from me? You know, feeling a certain way, and this is kind of the way, something I was thinking about when Forrest was making his comments earlier, feeling a certain way doesn't necessarily make it true. And I see that a lot in the Psalms. I see that with Elijah when he was hiding from Jezebel. I alone am left to serve thee. What did God tell him? I've got 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. You may feel a certain way, but your perception of things may not be reality. I don't know if you have heard that phrase, perception is reality. No, it's not. Your perception can be wrong, can be skewed by your circumstances, by your feelings. So, it's not that God is hidden or unfindable, let's say. So we need to keep that in mind as we read these Psalms too. This is a person, the word we use sometimes is venting. This is how he feels. And David did that too. Now, this is not David writing this particular psalm, so far as we have record, but he felt the same way David felt. What was that? Is it Psalm 22? Where, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? You remember when we went through that psalm, we talked about this. And that's how he feels in the beginning of the psalm, but halfway through he says, you've not forsaken me, you have answered me. So just because you feel a certain way, and every day can be different, depending on what happens. You have some really good days, and then one day you get up, and maybe the first thing that happens is you just don't feel too good, and then you get some bad news, and it's just a bad day. But that your experience in that moment doesn't change the reality of God and the promise of His presence and things like this. So, verse 18, lover and friend hast thou put far from me, and mine acquaintances into darkness. Now again, not knowing all the historical background and all that, we don't know exactly what this person's writing about, but one thing that I thought of when I read that psalm is God gets a lot of blame for things that He has nothing to do with, just like with Job. Any questions on Psalm 88? I know that was kind of a quick cover, but we've talked about that stuff so much. All right, Psalm 89, just quickly. A few things. Several words that I want to point out. One word that you're going to notice repeated, or 2 words you'll notice repeatedly, is mercy and faithfulness. And so I wrote the definitions because the Hebrew language is a bit different than the Greek, or certainly our English, but the word mercy in this text, used repeatedly, means loving kindnesses. It's plural. It's not just loving kindness, it's loving kindnesses. mercies and acts of kindness and goodness. Faithfulness, okay, so like in verse 1, with my mouth will I make known thy faithfulness to all generations. Well, that's truth and dependability. And that's part of the nature of God. He's true to His word. He's dependable in all things, in all situations. So you see those words repeated. And there are other words that come out in this text. Verse 5, wonders. Let's see here. God is, verse 8, He is mighty. The King James says strong. New King James says mighty. Again, His faithfulness is mentioned. His righteousness is discussed about in this chapter. Look, in fact, at somebody read Psalm 89 and verse 14. I want to notice some differences here. Righteousness and justice. If you're looking at a King James, it says justice and judgment. Those two words sound very similar. Well, it's His righteousness and justice are the foundation of His throne. Think about the foundation of His throne. The King James says the habitation of His throne. Everything God does is based on the fact that He is righteous and that He will administer justice. Everything He does is based on that. That's the foundation of His throne. Throughout the rest of this psalm, you have some messianic references. For instance, Psalm 89, verse 29, verse 28 beginning. My mercy will I keep for him forevermore, and my covenant shall stand fast with him. His seed also will I make to endure forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. Now, if you go back up into verse 20, who's he talking about? Verse 20. Okay, David. All right? But who is David's seed who would endure forever? Verse 29. That can only be one person. That can only be Jesus. And so this is a messianic psalm, and these passages are quoted in the New Testament. Go down to verse 35. He says, once have I sworn by my holiness that I will not lie unto David. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. That's told to us in Luke chapter 1, in Gabriel talking to Mary about Jesus having the throne of David and it lasting forever. It shall be established forever as the moon and as a faithful witness in heaven. Verse 37. There are so many prophecies of Christ like this that are referenced and then shown as fulfilled in the New Testament. Well over 300 prophecies, not psalms, prophecies fulfilled about concerning Christ and His kingdom. Didn't really have anything else. One of the things I wanted to do throughout this study of the Psalms is pay attention to those messianic passages. And notice there in verse 35, and we'll kind of close here, I guess. Verse 35, once I have sworn by my holiness. What is the holiness of God? What does that mean? It's deeper than that. I mean, that's, yes, goodness. This is His transcendence. He's over and above everything. A word sometimes that's used is His sovereignty. By my holiness I have sworn. His name is holy. What is that? I think it's Psalm 111 and verse 9. Holy and reverend is His name. God swore by His own name that these prophecies, that these promises would come to pass. And we know, of course, that they did through Jesus. And again, Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 13. If I'm not mistaken, there's a passage in Acts 15 that talks about the sure mercies of David, talking about the promises that God had made. And it's all connected, it's Acts 13, beginning in verse 33. It's all connected in that He has raised up Jesus from the dead And there he mentions, as it's written in the second psalm, he raised him from the dead to give him the sure mercies of David, Acts 13:34. And so this particular psalm here is connected to all of those promises. And 3 or 4 times right there at the end of Acts chapter 13, Acts 13 really beginning in verse 32 down through about verse 40, just within that one group of passages, verses, is the resurrection mentioned 4 or 5 times. So that's part of this promise that we're dealing with here in Psalm chapter 89. Any questions or comments on any of this? Verse 36. He's talking about Christ, the seed of David. It's like Romans 1 and verse 4, he is of the seed of David according to the flesh. That's what he's talking about there. Okay? Incline, if that's the same word I'm thinking, it's the idea of when God cups his ear. 88:2. Yeah, it's the idea of kind of stretching out and listening closely. Yeah, and that idea is repeatedly mentioned in the Psalms, that God bends over and cups his ear to listen to his people. All right, guys. Appreciate your attention.